The pistol shot cracked through the crisp Montana air, making Elizabeth Prentiss flinch as the stagecoach driver fired his warning into the sky. With trembling hands, she clutched her weathered carpetbag to her chest, the dust of the frontier settlement already coating her once fine traveling clothes. It was 1876, and the West was still wild, untamed, and dangerous, especially for a woman running from her past. Last call for Whitewater Creek. Board now or wait 3 weeks for the next coach. The driver's gruff voice carried across the small settlement's main street where Elizabeth stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the dilapidated wooden building that served as both general store and stagecoach office. Whitewater Creek had been meant to be just another stop on her journey westward, another place to disappear for a few weeks before moving on. That was before she'd met Nathan Yates. Elizabeth took one hesitant step toward the waiting coach, then another. She'd arrived 6 months ago with barely enough money to rent a room above the saloon and take a position as a schoolteacher. The children needed education, the town elders had said, and they didn't ask too many questions about where she'd come from or why a woman of obvious breeding was traveling alone to the edge of civilization. "Madam, you coming or staying?" The driver was growing impatient, checking his pocket watch and frowning at the eastern sky where the first hint of dawn was breaking. "I'm coming," Elizabeth called, her voice steadier than she felt. She glanced back at the small cabin at the edge of town, Nathan's cabin, where she knew he would be sitting on the porch, waiting, just as he'd promised when she'd left him last night. "I won't stop you," he'd said, his voice low and husky in the darkness of his bedroom. "But I'll be waiting on that porch until you either leave town or come back to me." The memory of his words made her heart constrict painfully. 6 months in Whitewater Creek had changed everything. 6 months of teaching in the one-room schoolhouse, of nodding politely to the townspeople on Sunday mornings, of gradually letting her guard down. 6 months of Nathan Yates watching her with those steady blue eyes, patient and kind, never pushing but always present. Nathan Yates, the local rancher who'd stumbled into her classroom one afternoon with a cut on his hand that needed tending. The man who'd started bringing her wildflowers every Friday after school. The man who'd shown her that not all men were like her father or the husband she'd fled. "Last chance, madam," the driver called, closing the door of the coach and moving toward the front where he would take his seat. Elizabeth squared her shoulders and walked forward, handing her bag up to the driver before accepting his help into the coach. She settled into the hard wooden seat, arranging her skirts around her and nodding politely to the elderly couple who shared the compartment. "Leaving someone behind, dear?" the older woman asked kindly, noting the tears Elizabeth was trying desperately to blink away. Just a friend," Elizabeth answered, turning to look out the small window as the coach lurched forward. As they passed the edge of town, Elizabeth couldn't help but turn her head to see Nathan's cabin. And there he was, just as he'd promised, sitting on the porch steps in the early dawn light. He wasn't waving or calling out. He was simply waiting, his broad shoulders set against the morning chill, his hat tipped low over his eyes. Something broke inside Elizabeth's chest. "Stop," she cried suddenly, startling her fellow passengers. "Please, I need to get out." The coach had barely slowed before Elizabeth was fumbling with the door handle, nearly falling to the dusty road in her haste. The driver shouted something, but she didn't hear him. She simply gathered her skirts and began to run back toward the cabin, toward Nathan, who was now standing on the porch watching her approach. By the time she reached the yard, she was breathless, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face flushed with exertion and emotion. "I couldn't," she gasped, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I couldn't leave." Nathan slowly descended the steps, his movements deliberate as though he feared she might startle and run again. His eyes never left her face as he approached. "Why not?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly trying to control. Elizabeth took a shuddering breath. "Because I love you," she whispered. "God help me, I love you and I'm terrified." Nathan closed the distance between them, his calloused hands coming up to cradle her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep. "I know you're scared, Lizzie. I know you're running from something or someone, but you don't have to run anymore, not from me, not ever from me." When his lips met hers, Elizabeth knew she'd made the right decision. But even as she melted into his embrace, the fear remained. Nathan didn't know the danger he was inviting into his life by loving her. He didn't know about Thomas, the husband she'd fled in St. Louis after years of abuse. He didn't know that Thomas had vowed to find her, no matter how far she ran. Elizabeth pulled back, looking up into Nathan's face, seeing the hope and love shining in his eyes. She couldn't tell him everything not yet, but she also couldn't leave him. "I need time," she whispered. "There are things you don't know about me, Nathan." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "We have all the time in the world, Lizzie. You came back, that's all that matters right now." But as Nathan led her up the porch steps and into his cabin, Elizabeth couldn't help glancing back at the road that led out of town. Somewhere, miles and months away, Thomas was looking for her. And if he ever found her, the happiness she'd discovered in Nathan's arms would be shattered forever. The morning sun bathed the interior of Nathan's cabin in a warm, golden glow as Elizabeth stepped inside. The space was modest, but well kept: a large main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors that led to a bedroom and a storage room. It wasn't grand like the house she'd shared with Thomas in St. Louis, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived in years. "Are you hungry?" Nathan asked, moving to stoke the dying embers in the fireplace. "I can make coffee, and there's some bread from yesterday." Elizabeth shook her head, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after her impulsive dash from the stagecoach. "I should go back to my room, get cleaned up before school." Nathan turned to face her, his expression serious. "There's no school today. It's Saturday, Lizzie." "Oh." The realization unsettled her. In her panic to leave town before her feelings for Nathan became too strong to resist, she'd lost track of the days. "I still should go. Mrs. Miller will wonder where I am." Mrs. Miller was the widow who owned the boarding house where Elizabeth rented a small room. The older woman had been kind to her, but also watchful, as most of the town had been when a refined woman from the East had arrived alone. "She knows where you are," Nathan said quietly. "I spoke to her last night after you left, told her I was hoping to convince you to stay." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush. "You told her about us," Nathan's lips quirked into a small smile. "There's nothing scandalous to tell, but folks in this town aren't blind, Lizzie. They've seen how I look at you, how I've looked at you since the day you arrived." The admission made her heart flutter. She'd been so careful, so determined to keep to herself, to not form attachments. But Nathan had worn down her defenses with his quiet persistence, his unwavering kindness. I'm not free, Nathan." The words came out in a rush, and immediately she regretted them. But she couldn't let him go on believing they could have a future without knowing at least some of the truth. Nathan's expression didn't change, but she noticed how his hands tightened on the poker he was holding. "You're married." It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth nodded anyway, unable to meet his eyes. "His name is Thomas. I left him in St. Louis 6 months ago." Nathan was silent for a long moment, then set the poker down carefully and crossed the room to sit in one of the 2 chairs by the unlit fireplace. He gestured for her to take the other. "Tell me," he said simply. Elizabeth sank into the chair, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. "We married when I was 19. He was charming, successful, my father's business partner. It seemed like a good match." She paused, the memories painful even after all this time. "The first time he hit me was 3 months after the wedding. He apologized, said it would never happen again. I believed him." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "It got worse over the years. At first it was just when he drank, but then it didn't matter if he was drunk or sober." Elizabeth's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "The last time he broke my arm, while it was healing, I planned my escape. I took what money I could from his study and I ran. I've been running ever since." "Does he know where you are?" Nathan asked, his voice carefully controlled. Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't think so. I've been careful. I changed my name not legally, but I've been using my mother's maiden name. I've moved several times." "But he has money connections. He said he'd find me if I ever left." Nathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Look at me, Lizzie." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, not ever again. Do you understand me?" The fierceness in his voice made her breath catch. You don't know him, Nathan. He's dangerous, and what we're doing, it's not legal. I'm still his wife under the law. There are ways to handle that, Nathan said firmly. We have a circuit judge who comes through every few months. He can grant a divorce on grounds of cruelty if we can prove it. Prove it. Elizabeth gave a bitter laugh. It's my word against his, and even if I could get a divorce, he'd never let me go so easily. His pride wouldn't allow it. Nathan reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. Then we'll face him together, but I'm not letting you run anymore, Lizzie, not unless you're running with me. The conviction in his voice made tears spring to her eyes. I can't ask you to take on my problems. You didn't ask, I'm offering. He squeezed her hand gently. I love you, Elizabeth. I think I've loved you since the first day you walked into town with your chin held high, looking like you belonged somewhere far grander than Whitewater Creek. A tear slipped down her cheek. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Nathan's expression softened. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I aim to spend however long it takes convincing you of that. Elizabeth felt something unfurling in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. I'm still afraid, she admitted. I know. Nathan stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. But you're not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. As she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she could stop running. The next few weeks passed in a haze of cautious happiness for Elizabeth. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse during the day, but her evenings were spent with Nathan cooking meals together in his cabin, reading by the fire, or simply talking as the sun set over the Montana mountains. The townsfolk of Whitewater Creek noticed the change in both of them. Elizabeth found herself greeted more warmly than before, included in conversations at the general store or after Sunday services. Nathan, always respected as one of the area's most successful ranchers, now received knowing smiles and good-natured teasing from the other men. It was a crisp October afternoon when Elizabeth dismissed her students early. The harvest was in full swing, and many of the children were needed at home to help with preserving food for the coming winter. Miss Prentiss. Emily Collins, a bright 10-year-old with braided blonde hair, lingered by Elizabeth's desk after the others had left. Yes, Emily. Elizabeth smiled at the girl as she organized her teaching materials. Is it true what my mama says, that you and Mr. Yates are going to get married? Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. Your mama shouldn't be gossiping about such things, Emily. The girl looked down abashed. I'm sorry, it's just, everyone says so, and I think it would be nice. Mr. Yates always looks happy when he sees you. Despite her embarrassment, Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. Thank you, Emily. Now run along home before your mother wonders where you are. After the girl left, Elizabeth sat at her desk for a long moment, thinking about the child's innocent question. She and Nathan hadn't discussed marriage, how could they, when she was still legally tied to Thomas? But the thought had crossed her mind more than once, especially on quiet evenings when Nathan would look at her with such tenderness that it made her heart ache. She was gathering her things to leave when a shadow fell across the schoolhouse doorway. Looking up, Elizabeth expected to see Nathan, who often met her after school to walk her back to town. Instead, she found herself face to face with Sheriff William Davis. Afternoon, Miss Prentiss, the sheriff said, removing his hat as he stepped into the schoolroom. Sheriff Davis was a fair man who kept order in Whitewater Creek with a firm but just hand. Elizabeth had always found him to be polite if somewhat distant. Sheriff, she nodded, continuing to gather her papers. Is there something I can help you with? The sheriff seemed uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Madam, I received a telegram today from St. Louis. Elizabeth's hands froze on her papers, her blood turning to ice in her veins. I see, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. And what does that have to do with me? Sheriff Davis sighed heavily. It's from a man claiming to be your husband, madam, a Mr. Thomas Prentiss. He says you're a missing person, that you took off with family valuables. He's offering a reward for information on your whereabouts. The room seemed to tilt around Elizabeth. She gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. And have you responded to this telegram, Sheriff? No, madam, I haven't. Sheriff Davis met her eyes directly. I wanted to speak with you first. Elizabeth swallowed hard. I appreciate that. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, studying her. Miss Prentiss or Mrs. Prentiss, I suppose I don't know what your situation is. But I've known Nathan Yates since he was a boy. He's a good man, and it's plain to see he cares for you deeply. He does, Elizabeth whispered. Then I think you ought to tell him about this telegram, and maybe tell me a bit more about why you left St. Louis in such a hurry. The sheriff's tone was gentle but firm. I can't ignore a legal communication, but I don't have to rush my response either. Relief washed over Elizabeth. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll speak with Nathan tonight. Sheriff Davis nodded, placing his hat back on his head. Good, and Miss Prentiss. This town takes care of its own. Remember that. After the sheriff left, Elizabeth sat heavily in her chair, her mind racing. Thomas had found her, or at least, he was close to finding her. The web of safety she'd been carefully weaving around herself in Whitewater Creek was beginning to unravel. By the time she left the schoolhouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Elizabeth walked quickly, not toward Nathan's ranch as she'd planned, but toward her room at Mrs. Miller's boarding house. She needed time to think, to plan. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure leaning against the hitching post outside the boarding house until she was nearly upon him. Lizzie, Nathan straightened, concern evident in his eyes. I waited at the schoolhouse, but you weren't there. I'm sorry, she said automatically. I had some things to finish up. Nathan studied her face. What's wrong? You're pale as a ghost. Elizabeth glanced around nervously. Not here. Can we go inside? Once in the privacy of her small room, Elizabeth paced back and forth while Nathan stood by the door, watching her with growing concern. Thomas knows where I am, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Or at least he knows I'm in Whitewater Creek. He sent a telegram to Sheriff Davis. Nathan's entire body tensed. What did it say? Elizabeth repeated what the sheriff had told her, watching as Nathan's expression darkened with each word. He's claiming you stole from him. Nathan's voice was tight with anger. I took money from his safe, Elizabeth admitted. Enough to get away, to survive until I could find work. It was technically his, but... She trailed off, then lifted her chin defiantly. I earned every penny of it. Every bruise, every broken bone, every humiliation I paid for that money 100 times over. Nathan crossed the room in 2 quick strides, pulling her into his arms. You don't have to justify anything to me, Lizzie. Not ever. She clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. What am I going to do, Nathan? If the sheriff responds to that telegram, he won't, Nathan said firmly. Not if I have anything to say about it. Elizabeth pulled back to look at him. The sheriff already said he'd give us time, but he can't ignore it forever. And even if he does, Thomas won't stop there. He'll come looking himself or send someone. Nathan's jaw set in a hard line. Then we'll be ready for him. You don't understand, Elizabeth said desperately. He's a powerful man, he has connections, money, and he's cruel, Nathan. Not just to me, but to anyone who crosses him. I'm not afraid of him, Lizzie. You should be. The words burst from her with unexpected force. I am. I've spent every day for the past 6 months looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. You haven't seen what he's capable of. Nathan took her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the steel in his voice. Listen to me. I don't care how powerful he is. I don't care what connections he has. You are mine to protect now, and I won't let anyone hurt you. The conviction in his voice made fresh tears spring to Elizabeth's eyes. I can't let you put yourself in danger for me. That's not your decision to make. Nathan's thumbs wiped away her tears. I love you, Elizabeth. That means your fight is my fight. I love you too, she whispered, the words still new and fragile between them. That's why I can't bear the thought of him hurting you. Nathan pressed his forehead to hers. He won't. We're going to figure this out together. As darkness fell outside her window, Elizabeth let herself be held by the man she loved, trying to believe that together they might be strong enough to face whatever was coming. But deep in her heart, the fear remained not just for herself, but for Nathan and for the future they might never have the chance to build. The following Sunday found the citizens of Whitewater Creek gathered in the small white church at the edge of town. Elizabeth sat beside Nathan in the third pew, acutely aware of the glances cast their way. Word of the telegram had spread quickly, as news always did in small communities, and she could feel the weight of speculation in every look. Pastor Matthew's sermon that morning was about courage in the face of adversity, and Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder if he had chosen the topic specifically for her benefit. When the service ended, she remained seated as the congregation filed out, not yet ready to face the inevitable questions. "You coming?" Nathan asked softly, his hand warm on her back. Elizabeth nodded, gathering her resolve. "Yes, there's no point hiding." Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clear. Several of the townspeople lingered in the churchyard, exchanging greetings and news. Elizabeth steeled herself as Mrs. Miller approached, the boarding house owner's expression one of concern. "Elizabeth, dear," the older woman said, taking her hands, "I wanted you to know that your room is secure for as long as you need it, no matter what anyone says." Touched by the unexpected support, Elizabeth squeezed the woman's hands gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. And if anyone comes asking questions who shouldn't," Mrs. Miller continued with a determined gleam in her eye, "well, my memory isn't what it used to be." "Might not remember having a boarder by your name at all." Nathan smiled at the older woman. "Much obliged, Mrs. Miller." As they made their way through the churchyard, more of the townsfolk approached with similar expressions of support. Mr. Peterson, the general store owner, assured Elizabeth her position as teacher was secure. Sheriff Davis nodded respectfully as they passed, a silent confirmation that he was still on their side. By the time they reached Nathan's wagon, Elizabeth was overwhelmed by the unexpected show of solidarity. "I don't understand," she said as Nathan helped her up onto the seat. "They barely know me." Nathan climbed up beside her and took the reins. "They know enough. They know you're a good teacher who cares about their children. They know you're honest and hardworking." He glanced at her with a small smile. "And they know I love you. That counts for something in these parts." As they drove away from town toward Nathan's ranch, Elizabeth felt a warmth spreading through her chest, displacing some of the cold fear that had taken root there. She wasn't alone anymore, not just because of Nathan, but because an entire community had silently agreed to stand with her. At the ranch, Nathan's foreman, a weathered man named Caleb, was waiting with news. "Got those fence posts set along the north property line, boss," he reported. "Jackson and the boys are finishing up the last stretch now." "Good work," Nathan said, helping Elizabeth down from the wagon. "Any trouble?" Caleb's eyes flickered briefly to Elizabeth before returning to Nathan. "Nothing we couldn't handle. Couple of strangers asking questions in town yesterday. Jackson ran into them at the saloon." Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of questions?" "About new folks in town," Caleb said, his tone careful. "Especially women traveling alone. Said they were looking for their sister, but Jackson didn't believe them." Nathan's arm tightened around Elizabeth's waist. "What did they look like?" "City men, well-dressed. One tall and thin, the other shorter, stocky build. Both armed, though they were trying not to show it." Not Thomas himself, then, Elizabeth thought with a mixture of relief and dread, but definitely men he would send probably Pinkerton detectives or bounty hunters. "Where are they now?" Nathan asked. "Left town this morning, heading east, but Jackson doesn't think they've gone far, likely just regrouping." Nathan nodded grimly. "Double the night watch. I want to know if anyone approaches the property day or night." After Caleb left, Elizabeth turned to Nathan, fear evident in her eyes. "They're getting closer. If they come back, we'll be ready," Nathan assured her, leading her into the house. "I've got 8 men working this ranch, all loyal and good with a gun if needed, and the townsfolk are on our side." "It won't matter to Thomas," Elizabeth said, sinking into a chair by the fireplace. "He'll just bring more men or come himself." Nathan knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens, but I'm not letting you face this alone, Lizzie. Not now, not ever." That night, Elizabeth stayed at the ranch rather than returning to her room in town. It wasn't the first time she'd spent the night, though they maintained separate bedrooms, a concession to propriety that seemed increasingly meaningless given the rumors already circulating about them. After a simple dinner, they sat together on the porch, watching as the stars emerged in the darkening sky. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distant pastures and the soft movements of the night watch as Nathan's men patrolled the property. "I've been thinking," Nathan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Maybe we should consider leaving Whitewater Creek, at least for a while." Elizabeth turned to look at him, surprised. "Leave, but this is your home, your ranch." "Home is wherever you are," he said simply. "The ranch will keep. Caleb can run things in my absence." A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat at the casual way he was willing to uproot his entire life for her. "Where would we go?" "West, California, maybe, or up to Canada, somewhere Thomas Prentiss has no reach. He'd still look for us," Elizabeth said softly. "And I'm tired of running, Nathan, so tired." Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then we fight, but on our terms, not his." "What do you mean?" "I mean we prepare, we gather evidence of what he did to you, we petition the court for a divorce on grounds of cruelty." Nathan's voice was firm, resolute. "We build a case so strong that even his money and connections can't overcome it." Elizabeth shook her head, unconvinced. "The law sides with husbands, Nathan, you know that. Not always, not when there's clear evidence of abuse." Nathan took her hand, his expression earnest. "Sheriff Davis knows a judge in Helena who's known for being fair-minded. If we can get your case before him, if, Elizabeth interrupted, pulling her hand away. "Meanwhile, Thomas gets closer every day. Those men in town, they'll report back to him. He'll know exactly where I am now." Nathan didn't argue with her logic. Instead, he stood and held out his hand. "Come with me, I want to show you something." Curious despite her fear, Elizabeth took his hand and followed him into the house, through the main room, and into what had once been a storage room but now served as Nathan's office. He lit a lamp and moved to a large oak desk in the corner, unlocking the bottom drawer with a small key. From the drawer, he withdrew a leather portfolio which he placed on the desk. "I've been gathering information," he said, opening the portfolio to reveal several documents. "Witness statements from people who saw how Thomas treated you in St. Louis." Elizabeth stared at the papers in shock. "How did you?" "I hired a man, a former Pinkerton detective who now works independently. He's been discreetly interviewing servants, neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something." Scanning the documents, Elizabeth recognized names: their housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, the next-door neighbor, Mrs. Witham, even Dr. Foster, who had treated her injuries on multiple occasions. "These people all testified?" she asked in disbelief. "They provided sworn statements," Nathan confirmed. "And there's more. Financial records showing that the money you took was actually part of your dowry, legally yours, not Thomas's." Elizabeth sank into the chair beside the desk, overwhelmed. "You did all this without telling me." Nathan knelt beside her chair. "I didn't want to give you false hope until I had something concrete, and I didn't want to remind you of painful memories until it was necessary." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "No one has ever fought for me like this, not ever." "Get used to it," Nathan said softly, cupping her cheek. "Because I'll fight for you every day for the rest of our lives if you'll let me." In that moment, looking into his eyes by the warm glow of the lamp, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, fear giving way to determination, resignation to hope. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Nathan said, "we prepare to meet Thomas Prentiss on our terms, not his. And when he comes, because I think we both know he will, we show him that you're not alone anymore." The night was far from peaceful for Elizabeth. She tossed and turned in the guest bedroom of Nathan's ranch house, her mind filled with images of Thomas's face contorted in rage, of the strangers asking questions in town, of all the ways her past could destroy the future she longed for. When dawn finally broke, she gave up on sleep and dressed quickly, moving through the quiet house to the kitchen. To her surprise, Nathan was already there, stoking the fire in the stove. "You're up early," he said, turning at the sound of her footsteps. Elizabeth managed a small smile. "I could say the same about you. I have ranch hands to organize, extra precautions to put in place." He poured her a cup of coffee from the pot warming on the stove. "And I wanted to send a rider to town with a message for Sheriff Davis." Taking the cup gratefully, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table. "What kind of message?" "I want him to telegraph that judge in Helena, see how quickly we can get your case heard." Nathan joined her at the table. The sooner we can start legal proceedings, the stronger our position. Elizabeth nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. Legal proceedings would take time they might not have if Thomas was already closing in. There's something else we need to discuss, Nathan said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Something I've been thinking about since yesterday. Elizabeth looked up from her coffee, struck by the intensity in his eyes. Marry me, Lizzie. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her fingers. What, Nathan? I can't. I'm already married. Not legally, not here in Montana territory, not yet. He reached across the table for her hand. We could have a civil ceremony, establish our commitment in the eyes of the community. It would strengthen our claim when we petition for your divorce. Elizabeth stared at him, torn between longing and practicality. It wouldn't be legal, not until the divorce is granted. Legal enough for now, Nathan insisted. And it would send a clear message to Thomas that you've moved on, that you have someone willing to stand beside you publicly. The idea was tempting, dangerously so. To be Nathan's wife, even if only in the eyes of Whitewater Creek, was everything she'd begun to dream of during these past months. When? She asked, the single word carrying all her hope and fear. Today, now, as soon as we can find Pastor Matthews. Nathan's eyes never left hers. I don't want to wait, Lizzie, not when every day brings Thomas closer. Elizabeth took a deep breath, weighing her fear against her love. Finally, she nodded. Yes, the smile that broke across Nathan's face was like the sun emerging from behind storm clouds. He stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. I'll send a rider for the pastor right away. 3 hours later, Elizabeth stood in the main room of Nathan's ranch house, their ranch house now, wearing her best dress, a dark blue wool with lace at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't a proper wedding gown, but it was the finest thing she owned. Pastor Matthews had arrived promptly, accompanied by Sheriff Davis, who would serve as a witness along with Caleb, Nathan's foreman. Mrs. Miller had also made the journey from town, bringing with her a small bouquet of late wildflowers and autumn leaves for Elizabeth to carry. It's not much of a wedding, Nathan apologized as they prepared to begin the ceremony. When this is all over, I'll give you a proper one. Whatever you want. Elizabeth shook her head, smiling through the tears that threatened. This is perfect. These are the people who stood by us when it mattered. I couldn't ask for more. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Pastor Matthews spoke of commitment and courage, of facing life's storms together. When it came time for vows, Nathan took Elizabeth's hands in his voice steady and sure. I, Nathan Yates, take you, Elizabeth, to be my wife. To stand with you through all that comes, to protect you with my life if necessary, to love you without reservation for all of my days. Elizabeth's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, but her eyes never left Nathan's. I, Elizabeth, take you, Nathan, to be my husband. To trust you with my heart and my future, to face our challenges together, to love you completely for as long as I live. When Pastor Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan pulled Elizabeth into a kiss that sealed their commitment before their small gathering of witnesses. For that moment, at least, Thomas Prentiss seemed very far away. After a small celebration with cake provided by Mrs. Miller and coffee all around, their guests departed, leaving the newly married couple alone as evening approached. Mrs. Yates, Nathan said softly, drawing Elizabeth into his arms once more, I've waited a long time to call you that. Elizabeth leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to savor the moment. It feels right, like I was always meant to be Elizabeth Yates. As darkness fell, they retired to what was now their shared bedroom, the boundaries of propriety dissolved by their marriage vows. Later, lying in Nathan's arms, Elizabeth felt a peace she had thought forever beyond her reach. What happens now? She asked, her head resting on his chest. Nathan's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Tomorrow, Sheriff Davis will send that telegram to the judge in Helena, and I'll file our marriage certificate with the county clerk. After that, we wait, but not passively. We'll be ready for whatever comes. Elizabeth nodded against his chest, trying to hold onto the sense of security she felt in his arms. But as she drifted towards sleep, a shadow crossed her mind, the certainty that Thomas would not surrender easily, and that the happiness she had found might still be shattered by the storm that was surely coming. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange mixture of domestic bliss and mounting tension. Elizabeth settled into life at the ranch, establishing routines with the household staff and continuing to teach at the schoolhouse in town. Nathan divided his time between ranch work and strengthening the property's defenses, never allowing Elizabeth to travel without an escort. Reports continued to filter in from various sources, strangers asking questions in neighboring towns. Men fitting the description of Thomas's hired investigators spotted on the stage to Helena. With each new sighting, the noose seemed to tighten around Whitewater Creek. "He's getting closer," Elizabeth said one evening as she and Nathan sat by the fire after dinner. "Circling us," Nathan nodded grimly. "He wants you to feel it, wants you afraid before he even shows his face." "It's working," she admitted, staring into the flames. "I jump at every sound. I can barely concentrate on teaching." Nathan crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it to take her hands in his. "Maybe you should stop going into town for a while. Stay here where I can protect you." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "No, I won't hide, Nathan. I won't let him make me a prisoner again, even if the prison is one of my own making." Pride flashed in Nathan's eyes. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Elizabeth Yates." The use of her new name still sent a thrill through her, a reminder of what they had built together despite the shadow hanging over them. The following day was unseasonably warm for late October, the sun bright in a clear blue sky as Elizabeth walked from the schoolhouse to the general store. One of Nathan's ranch hands, a young man named Timothy, trailed a discreet distance behind her constant shadow these days when Nathan couldn't be with her himself. Inside the store, Elizabeth handed her shopping list to Mr. Peterson. As the shopkeeper gathered her items, the bell above the door jingled, announcing another customer. Elizabeth turned automatically, then froze. The man who entered was tall and impeccably dressed in a suit that spoke of Eastern wealth and privilege. His dark hair was streaked with distinguished silver at the temples, and his clean-shaven face might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes. Thomas. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as those familiar eyes found her, widened slightly in recognition, then narrowed with a possessiveness that made her feel ill. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, carrying easily across the store. "How wonderful to find you at last, my dear." Mr. Peterson looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "You know this gentleman, Mrs. Yates." The deliberate use of her married name, her new married name, didn't go unnoticed by Thomas. A flicker of anger passed across his face before his mask of civility returned. "Mrs. Yates," he repeated, his tone dangerously soft. "I believe there's been some confusion. This is Mrs. Elizabeth Prentiss, my wife." Elizabeth straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of courage she'd built during her months with Nathan. "I was Mrs. Prentiss," she said clearly. "I am now Mrs. Yates." Thomas's laugh held no humor. "Bigamy is a serious crime, Elizabeth, as is theft, but we can discuss your legal indiscretions privately." He turned to Mr. Peterson with a disarming smile. "Would you excuse us? I need a moment with my wife." Before the shopkeeper could respond, the door opened again and Timothy stepped inside, his hand resting casually near the gun at his hip. "Everything all right, Mrs. Yates?" he asked, his eyes fixed warily on Thomas. "Yes, Timothy," Elizabeth said, grateful for the young man's presence. "Mr. Peterson, I'll collect my purchases later if that's acceptable." The shopkeeper nodded, still looking uncertainly between Elizabeth and Thomas. "Elizabeth," Thomas said, his voice hardening, "don't make a scene. Come with me now and we can resolve this civilly." Elizabeth met his gaze directly, something she would never have dared do during their marriage. "There's nothing to resolve, Thomas. Our marriage is over. I've filed for divorce on grounds of cruelty, and I have witnesses who will testify to your treatment of me." Anger flashed in Thomas's eyes, quickly masked. "Ridiculous accusations. No court will believe the hysterical claims of a woman who abandoned her husband and stole his property." "My property," Elizabeth corrected him. "My dowry, which you had no right to control." Thomas took a step toward her, but Timothy moved quickly to position himself between them. "That's close enough, mister," the ranch hand said, his hand now resting openly on his gun. For a tense moment, the store was silent. Then Thomas stepped back, straightening his jacket with a dismissive gesture. Very well. If you insist on public humiliation, so be it. But this conversation isn't over, Elizabeth. I'll be in town for some time, it seems. With that, he turned and left the store, the bell jingling cheerfully in his wake. Elizabeth's legs nearly gave way beneath her. She clutched the counter for support as Mr. Peterson hurried to bring her a chair. "Should I fetch the sheriff, Mrs. Yates?" Timothy asked, his young face creased with concern. Elizabeth nodded shakily. "Yes, and then ride to the ranch. Tell Nathan, tell him Thomas is here." While Timothy hurried to follow her instructions, Elizabeth sat in the chair Mr. Peterson had provided, trying to calm her racing heart. Thomas had found her, just as he'd promised he would, but he'd found a different Elizabeth than the one who had fled St. Louis, and Elizabeth with allies, with legal proceedings already in motion, with a husband who would fight for her. Still, the cold fear that had gripped her at the sight of Thomas lingered. She knew better than anyone what he was capable of when his pride was wounded, when he felt his possession was being taken from him. By the time Sheriff Davis arrived at the general store, Elizabeth had regained some of her composure. She recounted the encounter steadily, answering the sheriff's questions with as much detail as she could provide. "He didn't threaten you directly?" Sheriff Davis asked, making notes in a small book. "Not in so many words," Elizabeth replied, "but Thomas rarely does." "His threats are implied, understood." The sheriff nodded grimly. "I'll have a word with him, make it clear that harassment won't be tolerated in my town. Do you know where he's staying?" "Likely the hotel," Elizabeth guessed. "Thomas wouldn't tolerate anything less." As if summoned by their conversation, the store door opened again and Nathan strode in, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "Lizzie," he said, crossing to her side immediately. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine," she assured him, taking his hand. "He just wanted to intimidate me, to let me know he'd found me." Nathan turned to the sheriff. "I want him out of town, Davis, today." Sheriff Davis shook his head regretfully. "I can't run a man out of town for talking to his legal wife, Nathan, not without more cause." "She's my wife now," Nathan said fiercely. "In the eyes of this community, yes, but legally." The sheriff spread his hands apologetically. "Until that divorce is granted, he has certain rights." Elizabeth squeezed Nathan's hand. "The sheriff's right. We need to be careful, follow the law." "That's the only way we'll win." Nathan's jaw clenched, but he nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but I'm not leaving her alone for a second while he's in town." "Wise decision," Sheriff Davis agreed. "And I'll keep an eye on Mr. Prentiss myself. First sign of trouble, I'll have grounds to intervene." As they left the store, Elizabeth leaned heavily on Nathan's arm, exhaustion setting in now that the immediate confrontation was over. Outside, Thomas was nowhere to be seen, but Elizabeth could feel his presence in the town like a dark cloud hanging over the buildings. "Let's go home," Nathan said softly, helping her into the wagon where Timothy waited with the reins. Home. The ranch, the place where she'd begun to feel safe. But as they drove away from town, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas had allowed this small retreat, that he was simply biding his time, planning his next move in a game where he had always made the rules. The following days settled into an uneasy pattern. Elizabeth continued teaching, always with Nathan or one of his trusted ranch hands nearby. Thomas made no further direct approaches, but was frequently seen around town dining at the hotel restaurant, conversing with townspeople, creating an impression of reasonableness that contrasted sharply with Elizabeth's accounts of his cruelty. "He's building sympathy," Elizabeth explained to Nathan as they sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset. "It's what he does. He makes people doubt me, question my stability." Nathan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "No one who knows you would doubt you, Lizzie." "You'd be surprised," she said softly. "Thomas can be very convincing when he wants to be. It's how he built his business, his social standing." A rider approached the ranch at a gallop, interrupting their conversation. Caleb dismounted quickly, climbing the porch steps with an envelope in his hand. "Telegram from Helena, boss," he said, handing the paper to Nathan. "Just came into town." Nathan opened it eagerly, reading the contents with Elizabeth looking anxiously over his shoulder. His expression brightened as he took in the message. "The judge can see us next week," he announced. He's coming to Whitewater Creek specifically for our case. Elizabeth's heart leapt with hope. So soon, apparently Sheriff Davis's messages carried some weight. And the judge seems particularly interested in cases involving. Nathan's voice hardened as he read the words, domestic tyranny. For the first time in days, Elizabeth felt a genuine smile spread across her face. 1 week. We just need to hold Thomas at bay for 1 week. Nathan folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. We can do that. The whole town's watching him now, and he knows it. As if to confirm his words, Caleb cleared his throat. There's something else, boss. The men Thomas brought with him, they've been asking around about the ranch, about our routines. Nathan's expression darkened. What kind of routines? When we change the night watch, which directions the men patrol, that sort of thing. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. They tried to get Jackson drunk at the saloon to loosen his tongue, but he was wise to them. Elizabeth felt the brief flare of hope begin to fade. He's planning something. Let him plan, Nathan said grimly. We'll be ready. That night, as they prepared for bed, Elizabeth noticed Nathan checking his revolver before placing it on the bedside table. Do you think it will come to that? She asked quietly. Nathan looked up, his expression softening as he met her worried gaze. I pray it won't. But I'm not taking any chances with your safety. Elizabeth crossed the room to him, placing her hand over his on the gun. I won't have you risking your life for me, Nathan. That's not your decision to make, he reminded her gently. I meant my vows, Lizzie, all of them. She pressed her forehead against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him. I'm so tired of being afraid, so tired of him having this power over my life. Nathan tilted her face up to his. 1 week, just 1 more week, and we can begin to put this behind us. But as they settled into bed, the night sounds of the ranch around them, Elizabeth couldn't shake the certainty that Thomas wouldn't wait for the judge's ruling, that he had already set in motion whatever plan would bring her back under his control. She was right. The attack came just before dawn 3 days later. Elizabeth woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting, Nathan already out of bed and pulling on his clothes. Stay here, he ordered, grabbing his gun. Lock the door behind me. Nathan, she began, fear strangling her voice. I'll be back, he promised, kissing her quickly before striding from the room. Elizabeth dressed hastily, her hands shaking as she fumbled with buttons and laces. More gunshots echoed outside, followed by the alarming sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the house. Moving to the bedroom window, Elizabeth peered cautiously through the curtains. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could make out several figures moving around the ranch yard. Nathan's men were exchanging fire with intruders who had taken cover behind the corral and outbuildings. A crash from the main part of the house made her jump back from the window. Someone was inside. Grabbing the small derringer Nathan had insisted she keep in her bedside drawer, Elizabeth moved to the bedroom door, listening intently. Footsteps. Heavy and deliberate, moving through the house toward the bedroom. Elizabeth? Thomas's voice calm and measured. I know you're in there. Come out now, and no one else needs to get hurt. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She backed away from the door, raising the small gun with trembling hands. Your cowboy husband is rather occupied at the moment, Thomas continued, his voice closer now. My men will keep him distracted while you and I conclude our business. The doorknob rattled, then stilled. Elizabeth held her breath, the derringer aimed steadily at the door. Very well, Thomas sighed from the other side. Have it your way. A moment later, the door shuddered under a heavy impact. Once, twice on the third blow, the lock splintered and the door swung open. Thomas stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, a small pistol held casually in his right hand. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Elizabeth's derringer aimed at his chest. Now, Elizabeth, he said, his tone that of a parent addressing a wayward child. Put that down before you hurt yourself. Stay back, Elizabeth warned, her voice steadier than she'd expected. I know how to use this. Thomas laughed softly. Do you? I doubt it. You never had the stomach for violence. He took a step into the room. Unlike your cowboy, who seems quite comfortable with it, 3 of my men are already injured. Good, Elizabeth said fiercely. They shouldn't have come here. Another step. Thomas was now fully in the room, his own gun pointed at the floor in a deceptively casual stance. This little adventure of yours has gone on long enough, Elizabeth. It's time to come home. I am home, she said, backing up until she felt the wall behind her. This is my home now, with Nathan. Thomas's face hardened. Nathan Yates is a criminal who abducted my wife and is now harboring her illegally. When the authorities hear my version of events, they won't believe you, Elizabeth interrupted. Not this time. We have witnesses, documentation of what you did to me. Servants and social inferiors, Thomas dismissed with a wave of his free hand. Their word against mine means nothing. And Dr. Foster, will his word mean nothing too? For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Thomas's eyes. Foster would never betray a patient's confidence. He already has, Elizabeth said, gaining confidence from Thomas's momentary doubt. He kept records, Thomas, detailed records of every broken bone, every bruise, and he's given sworn testimony. Thomas's expression darkened dangerously. Then I'll deal with Foster after I deal with you. In one swift movement, he raised his gun to point at Elizabeth. Drop the Derringer, Elizabeth, now. Elizabeth's finger tightened on the trigger, but she couldn't bring herself to pull it. Despite everything Thomas had done to her, despite knowing what he was capable of, she couldn't shoot him in cold blood. Seeing her hesitation, Thomas smiled coldly. As I thought. You're still the same weak, obedient wife underneath it all. Now put the gun down and come with me. My carriage is waiting behind the property. Elizabeth lowered the Derringer slowly but didn't release it. And if I refuse, then I'll shoot you in the leg, Thomas said matter-of-factly. You'll still come with me, but you'll be in considerably more pain. Your choice. Before Elizabeth could respond, a new voice entered the conversation, hard, cold, and filled with barely controlled rage. You'll do no such thing, Prentiss. Nathan stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed steadily at Thomas's head. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but his hand was rock steady. Thomas reacted instantly, swinging his gun toward the new threat. Ah, the devoted husband arrives. Put your gun down, Yates, or I'll shoot her. Nathan didn't waver. You're not leaving this ranch with my wife. Not today, not ever. She's not your wife, Thomas snarled, his composure finally cracking. She's my property, and I've come to reclaim what's mine. The word property ignited something in Elizabeth, a final, burning anger that consumed the last of her fear. With Thomas's attention focused on Nathan, she raised the Derringer once more. I am not your property, she said clearly. Both men turned toward her voice, and in that moment of distraction, the sound of a gunshot filled the room. Thomas staggered backward, a look of shock on his face as he looked down at the spreading stain on his shoulder. His gun clattered to the floor as he clutched at the wound with his good hand. You shot me, he said incredulously, staring at Elizabeth. You actually shot me. Elizabeth lowered the Derringer, her hand finally beginning to shake. And I'll do it again if you ever come near me or my husband. Nathan moved quickly to kick Thomas's fallen gun away, then kept his own revolver trained on the wounded man as he crossed to Elizabeth's side. Are you all right? He asked urgently. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak as the full impact of what she'd done began to sink in. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Boots thundered on the porch, and a moment later Sheriff Davis appeared in the doorway, his own gun drawn. What in God's name, he began, taking in the scene before him. Thomas Prentiss broke into our home with armed men, Nathan explained, his arm protective around Elizabeth's shoulders. He threatened my wife. She defended herself. The sheriff looked to Elizabeth for confirmation. She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. He said I was his property, she said clearly. He threatened to shoot me and drag me away. Sheriff Davis nodded grimly, then turned his attention to Thomas, who was now sitting on the floor, his face pale with pain and rage. Thomas Prentiss, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, and assault with a deadly weapon. The sheriff moved forward to secure Thomas's uninjured arm. Your men outside are already in custody. This isn't over, Thomas spat, glaring at Elizabeth as the sheriff hauled him to his feet. No court in this territory will convict a man for trying to reclaim his legal wife. We'll see about that, Sheriff Davis said, steering Thomas toward the door. The judge arrives in 4 days. You can make your case to him from a cell. After they left, Elizabeth sagged against Nathan, the derringer finally slipping from her numb fingers. He caught her as her knees gave way, lifting her easily and carrying her to the bed. "It's over," he murmured, cradling her against his chest. "It's over, Lizzie. You're safe now." But as Elizabeth closed her eyes, listening to the steady beat of Nathan's heart, she knew it wasn't quite over yet. There was still the judge, still the legal battle ahead, but for the first time since she'd fled St. Louis, she truly believed she might win, that she might finally be free. The next 4 days passed in a blur of statements and preparations. Thomas remained in the town jail, his wound tended by the local doctor, but not serious enough to require his release. His men, those who weren't too badly injured in the firefight, occupied the adjacent cells. Sheriff Davis had telegraphed for additional deputies from neighboring towns to help maintain security until the judge arrived. Elizabeth spent hours with Nathan and Sheriff Davis, going over her testimony, organizing the evidence they had gathered against Thomas. The sworn statements from St. Louis were supplemented by accounts from Whitewater Creek residents who had witnessed Thomas's behavior since his arrival, his threatening manner, his orchestration of the attack on the ranch. "It's a strong case," Sheriff Davis assured them the evening before the judge was due to arrive. "Judge Harmon is a fair man. He'll see the truth." Elizabeth nodded, wanting to believe him but still haunted by the memory of Thomas's confidence, his certainty that the law would side with him as it always had. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly after the sheriff had left. "What if the judge rules in Thomas's favor?" Nathan took her hands in his gaze steady and determined. "Then we leave. Tonight, if necessary, we'll go where he can't find us." Elizabeth shook her head. "I won't ask you to abandon your ranch, your life here. You're not asking, I'm offering." Nathan's voice was firm. "But it won't come to that, Lizzie. I believe in the justice we're fighting for." Judge Harmon arrived on the morning stage, a tall, imposing figure with a silver beard and piercing eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The town had arranged for the trial to be held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate the proceedings and the many spectators who wished to attend. By noon, the church was packed. Elizabeth sat beside Nathan in the front pew, acutely aware of the whispers and stares from those assembled. Across the aisle, Thomas sat with a lawyer he had summoned from Helena, his arm in a sling but his expression as confident as ever. Judge Harmon called the court to order, his voice resonating through the hushed building. "We are here to consider 2 matters," he announced. First, the petition for divorce filed by Elizabeth Prentiss, now using the name Elizabeth Yates on grounds of cruelty. Second, the criminal charges against Thomas Prentiss for breaking and entering, attempted kidnapping, and assault with a deadly weapon. The proceedings began with Thomas's lawyer arguing that Elizabeth was still legally Thomas's wife, that her marriage to Nathan was invalid, and that Thomas had every right to reclaim his runaway spouse. When it was Elizabeth's turn to testify, she walked to the front of the church on shaking legs. Taking the oath, she faced the assembly, her eyes finding Nathan's supportive gaze in the crowd. "Mrs. Prentiss," Judge Harmon began, using her legal name, "please tell the court why you left your husband in St. Louis." Elizabeth took a deep breath and began to speak. She described the early days of her marriage, how Thomas's charming exterior had hidden a controlling, violent nature. She recounted specific incidents of abuse, the broken arm when she had spoken to another man at a dinner party, the bruises hidden beneath high-necked dresses, the constant fear that pervaded her daily life. As she spoke, the church grew so quiet that the ticking of the judge's pocket watch seemed unnaturally loud. Some women in the audience wept quietly. Others looked away, unable to bear the detailed account of suffering. Thomas's lawyer cross-examined her aggressively, suggesting she was unstable, prone to exaggeration, motivated by a desire to abandon her responsibilities and take up with a younger man. But Elizabeth remained steady, answering each accusation with clear, factual responses. Dr. Foster's sworn statement was read into evidence, detailing each injury he had treated over the years of the Prentiss marriage. Servants testified to hearing arguments, to seeing Elizabeth's bruises, to Thomas's threatening behavior. When Nathan took the stand, he described finding Elizabeth that first day in Whitewater Creek, her wariness, her reluctance to trust, the gradual process of earning her confidence. He recounted Thomas's arrival in town and the pre-dawn attack on the ranch without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. By late afternoon, the evidence had all been presented. Judge Harmon called a brief recess to consider his ruling, leaving the church buzzing with speculation. "Whatever happens," Nathan whispered to Elizabeth as they waited, "remember that I love you. That won't change no matter what he decides." Elizabeth squeezed his hand gratefully, drawing strength from his unwavering support. When Judge Harmon returned, the church fell silent once more. He took his place at the front, surveying the assembled townsfolk with grave eyes before speaking. "In the matter of the divorce petition," he began, "I find the evidence of cruelty compelling and thoroughly documented. No woman should endure what Mrs. Prentiss has described, and no man has the right to treat his wife as property to be controlled through violence and fear." Elizabeth's heart leapt with hope as the judge continued, "I hereby grant the petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. Elizabeth Prentiss is no longer bound in marriage to Thomas Prentiss, effective immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas half rose from his seat, his face flushing with anger, but his lawyer pulled him back down. "Furthermore," Judge Harmon continued, "I order that the sum of $5,000 be transferred from Thomas Prentiss's accounts to Elizabeth as settlement, representing the return of her dowry plus compensation for her suffering." The judge then turned to the criminal charges, his expression hardening. "Regarding the attack on the Yates ranch, the evidence clearly establishes that Thomas Prentiss orchestrated an armed assault with the intent to abduct Elizabeth against her will. This is not the action of a man seeking legal recourse, but of one who believes himself above the law." Thomas was now openly seething, his lawyer's restraining hand ignored as he glared at the judge. "I sentence Thomas Prentiss to 3 years in the territorial prison for these offenses. His accomplices will serve terms of 1 year each." Judge Harmon's gavel came down with finality. "This court is adjourned." The church erupted in sound-relieved exclamations, congratulations called to Elizabeth and Nathan, angry protests from Thomas as Sheriff Davis and his deputies moved to take him into custody. "This isn't over," Thomas shouted as he was led away. "I'll appeal, you haven't heard the last of me." But his threats seemed hollow now, diminished by the force of the judge's ruling and the community that had rallied around Elizabeth. Nathan pulled Elizabeth into his arms, heedless of the crowd around them. "It's done," he whispered against her hair. "You're free, truly free." Elizabeth clung to him, tears of relief streaming down her face. After so many months of fear, of looking over her shoulder, of preparing for the worst, it was almost impossible to believe it was really over. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset, the reality of her new situation began to sink in. Thomas would be transported to the territorial prison the following day. The divorce was final. The money Judge Harmon had awarded her would arrive within the month. "We should make it official," Nathan said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Elizabeth turned to look at him, puzzled. "Make what official?" "Our marriage." He took her hand, his expression earnest. "Now that you're legally free, we can have a proper wedding. A real one, recognized by law as well as by our hearts." Elizabeth smiled, the last lingering shadows of fear finally receding. "I'd like that, but you know I already consider myself your wife in every way that matters." "I know." Nathan's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "But I want to give you everything, Lizzie. Everything you deserve, starting with a wedding day untainted by fear." "When?" she asked, already imagining it a day of pure joy, surrounded by the friends who had become family to her in Whitewater Creek. "How about Christmas?" Nathan suggested. "It's just 6 weeks away. Long enough to plan something special, but not so long that I have to wait to call you Mrs. Yates in the eyes of the law as well as the community." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Christmas sounds perfect, a new beginning at the end of the year." Nathan pressed a kiss to her temple. "The first of many new beginnings for us, I hope." 3 years later, Elizabeth stood on the same porch, watching as Nathan taught their 2-year-old son, Samuel, to ride his first pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the ranch yard, bringing a smile to Elizabeth's face as she cradled her newborn daughter against her chest. The years since Thomas's imprisonment had been the happiest of her life. Their Christmas wedding had indeed been everything she could have wished for, a joyous celebration in the church, decorated with evergreens and candles, the entire town in attendance. Judge Harmon had returned specifically to perform the ceremony, his presence a powerful symbol of the justice that had finally been served. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Nathan's skillful management, combined with Elizabeth's careful accounting, had expanded their operation considerably. They now employed twice as many hands and had built a new, larger house to accommodate their growing family. News had reached them 6 months ago that Thomas had been released from prison after serving his full sentence. For a few weeks, Elizabeth had found herself glancing nervously over her shoulder again, wondering if he might seek revenge. But as time passed with no sign of him, she gradually relaxed. Reports from contacts in St. Louis indicated that Thomas had moved east to New York, his reputation in Missouri too damaged by the public scandal of his imprisonment to rebuild his life there. "Mama, look," Samuel called, waving enthusiastically as Nathan led the pony in a circle. "I riding." "I see you, sweetheart," Elizabeth called back, adjusting baby Catherine in her arms. "You're doing wonderfully." Nathan looked up at her, his face alight with pride in their son. The years had added a few lines around his eyes, a touch of silver at his temples, but he was still the same strong, steadfast man who had waited on this very porch for her to return that dawn 3 years ago. As the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth thought about how close she had come to missing all of this life, this love, this family. If she had kept running that day, if she hadn't looked back and seen Nathan waiting. Catherine stirred against her chest, tiny fingers flexing as the baby yawned. Elizabeth pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of her. "Elizabeth," Nathan called, leading the pony toward the house with Samuel still proudly perched on its back. "Come down here and see what your son can do." Setting aside her reflections, Elizabeth descended the porch steps to join her family in the yard. As Nathan's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her and Catherine close while Samuel demonstrated his newfound riding skills, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home at last. Not in a place, but in the love of the man who had been patient enough to wait for her on that porch at dawn, and brave enough to stand beside her through the storm that followed. The man who had shown her that love wasn't about possession or control, but about freedom and trust and unwavering support. The man who had given her not just his name, but a future filled with more joy than she had ever dared to imagine.